I am the president of Women Accelerators. Thank you for joining Melody and Women Accelerators today for this webinar. We have been absolutely overwhelmed with the number of registrants today, and at the same time, so excited to see how many are going through the exact same feeling. Before I hand the baton back to Melody, I wanted to share a little bit about Women Accelerators with everyone. Women Accelerators is a volunteer-run nonprofit organization based in Cambridge. Our organization started in 2011, and we are passionate about promoting the advancement of women and increasing gender equity. Our mission is to provide a network and community where women of all background and career level can access resources tailored toward their career goals. And our vision is to generate a community of like-minded, high-achieving women who are inspired to help each other to succeed in the workplace. So what exactly do we do? We host bi-monthly events featuring guest speakers to touch on topics such as gender equity, women empowerment, and women leadership. In addition to this webinar today, we have a great lineup of in-person events in the next month. One is actually next week at CIC on Handling Difficult Conversations with Ease by Brenda Baker, and another at the Broad Institute on Redefining Success, Bring Your Values Alive at Work by Etta Jacobs. All our event details can be found on our website at womenaccelerators.org. And lastly, but not least, we also have a mentoring program starting in January of 2019. We will start taking applications in November, so stay tuned and sign up for our email and follow us on social media. We hope to see everyone in person at our future events. Thanks again for joining us today. And Melody, back over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Great, so I'm gonna put you back on mute. And I will dive right in. So before we get into the content, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit. So I am Melody Wilding, and I'm a licensed social worker who helps high-achieving women deal with the ups and downs of success. So I am also a professor of human behavior at a university here in New York City. And previously, before becoming a full-time coach, I actually worked in health tech, doing product development, marketing, operations, and I also worked as a therapist. So just a few reminders before we begin. We will have Q&A at the end, so please do, as I'm going along, pop your questions in the chat, in the Zoom chat at the on the side of your screen. And there's no need to take notes because you will get a recording of this presentation after today. And you'll also get a workbook that goes through the activity I'm going to discuss with you and some of the resources I'll cover. So no worries, you can devote your full attention while you're here. And so today, what we'll be covering. First, I want to go into understanding a little bit more about what imposter syndrome is, the history of it, the different factors that are at play that contribute to it, and the negative effects it may be having on your career that you don't even realize. And then more importantly, we're going to go into what you can do to manage imposter syndrome over the long term, as well as in the moment, things that you can start doing today so that you can really develop that healthy sense of confidence in your career. And so as I mentioned, we'll have time for Q&A and hopefully a bit of time for discussion. So first, I wanted to tell you a little bit more about my imposter syndrome journey, because I think most of all that many of you will relate and may be able to see pieces of yourself in my story. So it starts out when I was very young. This is a little bit of a joke, but my name is Melody and I actually have zero musical talent. So from the time I was very young, I've always had people say, "Oh, your name is Melody. Do you sing or play an instrument?" And I've always had to say no. So this actually did, in all seriousness, lead me to kind of questioning my capabilities from a very young age. And flash forward, in school, I was a picture of a classic high achiever. So I was a hard worker, top of my class. I'm sure that many of you here can relate to that, since research shows that imposter syndrome shows up disproportionately among successful, accomplished women. And so from the outside, it looked like all of these achievements looked really great. But from the inside, I certainly didn't feel that way. I struggled constantly with internally questioning myself. I was always worrying about the future and when things would come crashing down. I was getting different degrees and certifications, but I still felt like I was a fake. And I was always waiting for that moment when I would feel qualified enough, yet that never really came. So as I went forward in my career, I was a non-technical person in a highly technical startup. And I was a social worker, of all things, among developers. So I felt like a little bit of an outsider, and that led me to questioning my ability to perform. So I couldn't really keep this in anymore for my own sake. So I started sharing these struggles at networking events and with other women in my life. And I was really shocked, pleasantly so, to find out that a lot of them felt exactly the same way. And it was very validating as I opened up about this for myself and for them to know that not only weren't alone, but we also weren't crazy. There wasn't something wrong with us because there was really this shared experience happening. And so about the same time, I first stumbled across the term imposter syndrome from Dr. Valerie Young, who's one of the foremost researchers on the topic. And it felt like someone was reading my diary. This was the first time that I actually recognized that there was a term for what I was going through, which was very soothing. And since then, I've dedicated my work to helping women deal with challenges like imposter syndrome that come up when you're really doing big things in the world and trying to advance in your career. So I've made it part of my mission as a coach to end the silence and the shame around imposter syndrome. And I've been very lucky to have the opportunity to work with women at companies like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, IBM. I was actually very grateful to give a TED Talk on the topic last year. So today I want to share with you some of the strategies I use when I work with my clients to manage those fraudy feelings when they do come up, and help you develop the confidence that you really need to own the achievements you do have in your career. So I want to know if any of you can relate to the following. So let me know in the comments if any of this is resonating with you or sounds familiar. A quick yes or a no will do, but I would love to hear if any of these sound familiar. So do you downplay your accomplishments? Do you dismiss them? Do you say that your success was just luck, or that, oh, it was nothing, it was a team effort, I didn't really do that much? Do you fear you'll be exposed as unintelligent or unqualified? So are you just waiting for the day that your boss comes by your desk and says, oh, you made a big mistake and we realize that we hired the wrong person for this role? Or that you somehow slid into the company through connections or charm or something like that? Do you constantly second guess yourself? Are you always wondering if you made the right decision? Do you get caught in just cycles of indecision and overthinking things because you're not sure what people will think of you, or what will happen if you go with one thing over another? And fundamentally, do you feel like you're not good enough or smart enough? I'm just going to pop over to the comments now. Let's see. So we got some yes, still yes, definitely, all the time, a lot of all the times. I hear you. So we're going to dig into some of this today. All of these statements that I've just gone through are just a few of the hallmarks of imposter syndrome. So even though this term, I'm sure a lot of you have just recently heard of this term, maybe in the past year or 2 years. So it's only recently that imposter syndrome has really entered kind of our public consciousness at this point, but it was actually first described in the late 1970s. So there were two researchers, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, and they were working in a university environment researching working with female graduate students. And they were the ones who first spotted this pattern of what they called intellectual phoniness among women. So women who felt like intellectual phonies. They had all these great degrees, they got into great schools, yet they still felt incapable. So many of the women actually said when they were studying them and they were describing how they felt, a lot of these women said that they felt like they had tricked the acceptance committee into letting them in somehow. They had fooled them, that they were actually smarter than they actually were. So Clance and Iams were the first ones to coin this term imposter syndrome and describe this widespread pattern of inadequacy that they observed among women. And so imposter syndrome is characterized by a crippling self-belief that you don't deserve your success or that you couldn't replicate it. So you couldn't do it again. You're a one-hit wonder, so to speak. So you don't believe you're worthy of the success you get, and you're not confident in your own ability to handle stress or handle challenges in the future. And so with imposter syndrome, it's marked by this inability to internalize your achievements, to accept them and internalize them yourself, despite obvious evidence to the opposite. So despite evidence of your intelligence, like having multiple degrees, like I mentioned, getting positive feedback in your role, let's say positive performance reviews or getting promoted, having certifications or certain qualifications. So imposter syndrome fundamentally represents this inaccurate self-assessment we make of ourselves and our own capabilities. And I do want to mention that imposter syndrome is not a clinical mental disorder. It's not something you go to a therapist and get diagnosed with. It is related to anxiety and depression. I do want to be clear about that. But imposter syndrome itself is better defined as an experience or a phenomenon. Okay, so when we look at imposter syndrome a little closer, it actually breaks down into a fairly predictable cycle. And I hope this is, I want to share this because I think it can be comforting to know that if it's a cycle, we can spot those patterns, we can spot the places where we have opportunities to change it. So it all starts with a triggering event. So up here we have that project or a piece of work. This is some sort of stress or a challenge. It's usually related to work because that's the domain where our intellect is being challenged the most, or where we're using it the most. And so that stress or a challenge sets off this chain reaction of habitual thoughts and feelings. So this is all that good stuff, like self-doubt, fear, getting afraid that you'll fail, worrying constantly. So all of that anxiety and fear comes in. And then these thoughts and emotions then influence our behavior. So imposter syndrome typically breaks down into two camps. So you have the over-preparation camp. I call this the diligent camp. These are the people who may overwork to the point of exhaustion and burnout. I was definitely in this camp. You work harder and harder in an effort to try to prove yourself. So this is the type of person who's known for sweeping in last minute. They make sure the entire project gets finished no matter what they have to do. They're maybe a little bit of a perfectionist. They're practicing a presentation 100 times, checking their code or their design obsessively for mistakes as a way to control that situation. Then we have the procrastination camp. So these are people who may have problems starting or finishing projects because of their fear. They worry that if they do take action or they do submit something or make themselves vulnerable to feedback, that's what will expose them as unqualified. So you might distract yourself with busy work and do things that are urgent and not important. You may distract with other vices, food, TV, whatever it is. You might avoid new challenges altogether. or reach assignments. So these are people I see who may stay in a job that is not good for them for way too long because they're afraid to take on that next challenge and be proved that they're a fraud. And so people ask me, generally people fall into one type versus another. You can be a mixture of both, but I would love to hear which you think you fall into. Do you think you're more of the over preparation side or more of the procrastination, or it's really more avoidance than procrastination side? So go ahead and pop that in the comments. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. I'm hearing some people are saying a mix of both. Yeah, it definitely depends on the situation. We got some over preparers, a little of both, more preparation. Great. And so what then happens in this cycle is we go through with the thing, whatever it is, a work assignment, putting ourselves up for a promotion, trying to get a new job. Typically we have an accomplishment. Things go well. We have a feeling of relief because it's like, oh, thank gosh, I got through it again. I got through one more, I got through this barrier. Thank goodness. And then we get positive feedback. People say we did well, we performed well, you were great. This work product is wonderful. You hit it right on the head. But what happens is we ignore or push that back because we attribute it either to effort. If we're in the over preparation camp, we say, oh, I worked really hard. It's just because I put in all those hours, and we discredit it as not due to our intellect. Or we discredit it because of luck. I got lucky this time. Things worked out, whatever it may be. So we ignore or we push away that feedback rather than internalizing it. And the cycle goes around again. We feel like a fake, we doubt ourselves, the depression, anxiety all comes in because we haven't internalized that positive feedback, and we're not confident in ourselves. And I may not have to tell you this, but imposter syndrome, this cycle leads to all sorts of negative effects. So of course we have the just general bad experience of feeling down on yourself and doubting yourself at every turn. But in your work, this manifests as a reluctance to asking for help. So you may be that lone worker who doesn't want to ask anyone for assistance, or you may not want to approach people on your team because you fear being seen as incapable and not up to snuff for your role. You may turn down new opportunities. So like I mentioned, a lot of people don't seek out stretch assignments or go for a job that they actually would be qualified for because they assume they're not worth it or good enough for it. You avoid feedback and criticism, which can actually be very important data about improving your performance. You have perfectionistic tendencies. Like I mentioned, the over preparation is big on that. Or actually it does lean into procrastination too, because you may not start things unless they can be absolutely and totally perfect. Procrastination, distraction, like I mentioned before. The negative self-talk is a big one, and we're going to tackle that today. And like I said, contributing to anxiety and depression, particularly important if you already have an underlying disposition for that. Okay, so what influences imposter syndrome? Like I said, if you're experiencing this, you're not wrong, you're not broken, but there are some things that can exaggerate it. So family of origin. You may have come from a family that places a high value on achievement and accomplishments. That's very common. Maybe in your family, you were labeled the good girl, the smart one. That also contributes to the identity we take into our careers. Socialization. Women are raised to be very agreeable, to be likable. We're groomed to be good students in our school systems and to really value our success. Women are often looked down upon if they're perceived as boastful or as promoting themselves. We also tell little girls not that women aren't good at math and science, for example. So then when we get into those arenas, we question our skills. And workplace cultures. So imposter syndrome is definitely exaggerated by workplace cultures that are very competitive, where there's a lot of comparison. Workplaces that lack mentorship are also difficult because women lack guidance, and they lack other mentors to see that, oh, other women go through this and it's okay. And it can be managed and overcome. So if you are in that type of environment, that further reinforces that feeling of being an outsider or a fake. Okay, if there is any good news, it's that imposter syndrome is very common. Studies show that up to 70% of people will experience imposter syndrome throughout the point of their career. So it's very likely that the person sitting next to you in a conference room is also having these similar thoughts and emotions, but we really don't talk about it enough, which is why it can feel so isolating. But for a variety of reasons, women are much more vulnerable. So there was actually a new report that came out in July, which said that 2/3 of women experience imposter syndrome, and that it's actually more prevalent with women who are working in design, information, and analytics. So up to 87% of women in these areas struggle with that feeling of constant self-doubt. And so that's and so the arrival fallacy. So what's important here, part of the paradox of imposter syndrome is that it actually becomes more acute the higher you rise and the more successful you get in your career. So like I mentioned earlier, I had this feeling that I would somehow arrive at some point in the future where I just magically felt secure and I no longer experience this sense of self-doubt. And this is falling into something that's known as the arrival fallacy. So it's when you say things like, I'll be happy when I get that promotion, or I'll feel confident after I get one more certification. And it's actually quite the opposite. So we've glorified this image of success that everything looks great on the outside, which is, this graph on the left here, what people think success looks like, when in actuality, what we don't talk about is that success is actually a very messy, complicated, ambiguous path. And that's why the higher we rise, the more we confront complex challenges, the more ambiguity there is, the more stressors there are and new challenges, and hence more imposter syndrome as a result. So I call this the high achievers paradox. And it's that sense of the more that you know, the less you feel like, the more that you know, the more you feel like you actually know nothing. So you are actually becoming less of a fraud because you're becoming more experienced, but you feel more like one. So it's great that now imposter syndrome there's so much more awareness for it, because we do have a lot of great leaders in the tech and business worlds who are starting to speak out about their struggles and normalize this more. But we actually do have a long way to go. So what I want to take you through now is to give you some tools that you can have in your toolbox to better deal with imposter syndrome as you rise to new levels of success. Because I have no doubt that everyone who is on this call today is that's one of your ambitions. So I first want to focus on what you can do to address those fraudy feelings and thoughts when they first pop up in that cycle. And give you tools to recognize and rewire them over the long term, because these feelings of self-doubt, fear, we don't want to make them go away. They're actually good in a sense because they protect us. They signal that they're trying to keep us safe. They're trying to keep us away from danger and keep us protected. So we don't want them to go completely away, but we want to get better at managing them so we can move forward. So I'm going to give you a strategy to use to kind of unwire that thinking or rewire that thinking over the long term. And then I'm going to give you some quicker tips and faster acting solutions to address imposter syndrome so that you can improve your confidence. So let's dive in. As I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest hallmarks of imposter syndrome is those critical self-beliefs. So that negative self-talk that we have going on, that we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, we're going to fail. That's one of the hardest parts of imposter syndrome to deal with because it's all internal, right? And so that's where I would like to focus today. So the truth is that many of the thoughts we have every day, some statistics say up to 70 or 85% of our thoughts that we have every day tend to be exactly the same. And that even goes especially for the unhelpful or the hurtful ones. So what happens is these thoughts become ingrained as automatic responses to stressors. So like I showed you on the imposter syndrome graph, you have a stressor and that immediately goes to these automatic thought patterns. So it's likely that many of the thoughts you have just become automatic reactions to stressful events, and that they're not actually a reflection of yourself or what's actually going on in reality. And so in psychology, these are what's called cognitive distortions. And that's in therapist speak. And basically what that means is that these are labels for different types of unhelpful thinking patterns. So just like it's helpful to know that there's this thing called imposter syndrome and that has a name, and that it means you're not crazy, it's also essential to know that these unhelpful thoughts also have a name and that they aren't a reflection of your identity. They're not evidence that you're a failure. In fact, most, if not all people, fall into these patterns at one time or another. So I want to go through these so you can see which sound like you and which you might be able to relate to. So there's no need to write them down. Like I mentioned in the workbook I've put together for you, they'll all be there. So I want to quickly go over each of these. And again, in the comments, please let me know if any of these resonate with you, if you've ever found yourself having these types of thoughts. So the first one is called catastrophizing, and that's when you expect disaster. So this is when I hear things like, what if I fail and then I end up broke and homeless on the street? So you immediately go from your situation to the absolute worst case scenario. Then we have all or nothing thinking. So these are when you think in terms of black or white. It can be only this or that, good or bad. There's no middle ground. There's no gray area. So this one comes up with perfectionism a lot. And it often looks like I have to be perfect or I'm a complete failure. If we go way back to school, a lot of times it comes from I have to get A+ or it wasn't good enough, right? Like a B- is, at least when I was younger, B- was like equal to failure. I might as well have gotten an F in that case. And that carries over today. So this project either is a complete success or it's a failure. There's no in between. Then we have overgeneralization. So this is when we assume that if something bad happened once, we expect that it will always happen that way. So let's say you screwed up once on something in an interview or something like that. Then you assume that you will always screw up in interviews. So we almost judge ourselves to, that would be like me at my age now, judging myself to when I was interviewing for my first job and I made some sort of faux pas and assuming, overgeneralizing that now I am forever bad at interviews. Then we have mental filter. This is a big one. You dwell on a single negative detail. So humans naturally have a negativity bias. We could hear tons of positive praise and we will pick out the one negative or semi-critical detail. So I see this all the time where I work with clients who obsess about, they may have gotten a stellar performance review but they will obsess about one area where they got meets expectations and not exceeds expectations. And so this one, it comes up a lot because of that negativity bias, which is also more pronounced with imposter syndrome. So it relates to how we discount any of the positives and we deflect that positive praise. Emotional reasoning. So you believe what you feel must automatically be true. So I think this one is best with an example. So this is where it basically means I feel stupid, therefore I am stupid. I feel unqualified, therefore I am unqualified. Right? Let me know if that one makes sense. Mind reading. So this is a big one in the workplace. Without people saying so, we think we know what they're feeling and thinking. This one happens a lot with email. So if someone didn't respond to my email, she must hate me. Or my boss didn't pick up my call, he must be really upset with that report I handed in. Yeah. And sometimes someone mentioned emotional reasoning is just reading my mind. Right. Yeah. So we make this assumption because I feel bad, I am bad. Right. So it's looking towards our inaccurate self-perception rather than reality. And the last one I want to mention, there's more in the workbook, but the last one I want to mention for now is personalization. So this is when we hold ourselves accountable for things that are beyond our control. I think this is very common for overachievers because we're used to being the ones that make things happen. We're used to being the doers. So we take on naturally a lot of that responsibility. So if something fails, project doesn't go through right, it's because we didn't spend enough time on it or we didn't do something. So we shoulder 100% of that responsibility for making something happen. Yeah, and I'm seeing people say mental filter all the time, catastrophizing, and you know, how will I afford something if I lose my job and things go poorly? And so with catastrophizing, we discount our own resourcefulness. Okay, so these limiting beliefs, these unhelpful thoughts, are what feed imposter syndrome. So they're right at the top of that cycle that I showed you. And like I said, the cycle is helpful to think about because if we know it's predictable, we know it's automatic, that gives us an opportunity to manage and control it better. So we know that these thoughts are largely learned, they're automatic, they're simply habits. And like any habit, we can actually undo them. We can unlearn them. So I want to teach you how to start doing that. So for the next few days, what I want you to do is record these examples of the negative self-talk you're having. So as you're going throughout your day, I actually want you to have a pen, and you can use the workbook that I put together for you. But I really want you to start bringing more awareness to how often these thoughts are coming up for you, especially when you feel stressed or overwhelmed or anxious. I really want you to start to notice just how common and repetitive those thoughts are. And what I anticipate, what I know you'll spot from that internal dialogue is just how often the same types of thoughts come up. So I like to call those greatest hits. And all of us tend to fall into, again, just like the over preparation or procrastination, we tend to fall into certain cognitive distortions. We tend to favor some over the others. So I really want you to record your inner monologue. What is your inner critic saying to you? And then start to label each of those negative thoughts with the appropriate cognitive distortion that matches it. And again, the worksheet will help you do this, but this is important to put a label on it because psychology shows that once we label something, whether that's an emotion, a thought, whatever it may be, that actually helps us get emotional distance from it. And it helps lower the volume, it helps bring down the power that thought has on us because we're able to put it in perspective more. We're able to see that it's an automatic learned passing thought rather than a manifestation of ourself. So I want you to name the pattern, whether that's catastrophizing, mind reading, emotional reasoning, whatever it may be. And I want you to get more well acquainted with your typical patterns. And then the last step is generating evidence of the opposite. So this is where you're going to refute those cognitive distortions by generating 1 to 3 examples, situations, experiences you've had in the past that prove that that cognitive distortion is incorrect. So this is writing down any specific facts or truths that logically demonstrate why that cognitive distortion is a myth. So for example, if you accuse yourself of always procrastinating, I want you to work on generating examples of instances where you did work hard, where you did put in effort, where you did force yourself to work on something and spent a lot of time preparing for it. I can give you another example of a client I'm working with now who is a UX designer. She's looking to switch into iOS development, which is a new area for her. And she is falling into a lot of emotional reasoning. She feels like because she's never done iOS development before, then she must not be good at it. And so for how we have been helping her refute that is pointing to times where she has dove into something new and was able to figure it out. And once we just shifted the frame that way, she was able to see that actually tech was a second career for her. So she's already done this once. She has already dove into a field she was completely unfamiliar with and figured it out. In the beginning, she may have felt stupid, but that cognitive distortion wasn't a sign of her ability to learn the skills that she needed to. Yep, and there are some, someone mentioned this does come from cognitive behavioral therapy, and there are apps out there that can help you do this too. So one is Mood Kit, which is a great one. So thank you for sharing that too. So this that I shared with you today, if any of you are familiar with cognitive behavioral techniques, they're a long-term strategy. This isn't something that you're going to be able to unwind overnight. This is years, if not decades, of conditioning and automatic patterns that have been set up. So with the remainder of our time, what I want to do is give you some faster acting strategies that you can use when imposter syndrome strikes in the moment. So the first one is accepting and not deflecting. So when we don't internalize our success, we're much more likely to push away that positive feedback. So I want you to look out for minimizing language that you're using that may signal this. So this is those phrases like, oh, it was nothing, it was a team effort, I just threw this together. So the goal of this is to, frankly, stop screwing yourself over. And instead practice welcoming in praise and not pushing it away. So how this deflection tends to look for a lot of women in particular is that we over explain why we accomplish something. So we may have this sort of word vomit of like, oh, it was nothing, so-and-so helped, I had a lot of time, blah, blah, blah. We go on and on about over explaining how we were able to accomplish something in response to positive praise. So when you get a compliment, this is something I want you to work on this week. When you get a compliment from someone, I want you to keep it at a tweet length response. And even better, if you can just say thanks and just move on. Really practice that skill of not over explaining yourself. And so I want you to say thanks and leave it at that. There is no reason to launch into an elaborate explanation of how you barely made the deadline or how it was just luck. You don't need to prove yourself. You don't need to justify yourself to anyone but yourself. So for example, someone congratulates you on landing a major client. All you can say is just, thanks, I'm glad all the hard work paid off, and leave it at that. or thank you, I'm really happy you said so, and just drop it there. And if you want to take it a step further, you can say something like, thanks so much, that really means a lot coming from you. Do you mind if I ask you for a little bit of feedback? What did you see in me in that meeting? What did I do well? What did you notice? Actually get comfortable leaning into asking people about what they thought you did well, instead of what weaknesses they think you need to patch. So really trying to focus on your strengths and amplifying those rather than trying to patch your weaknesses. Okay, and I want you to create a brag file. So this is a tangible, concrete way to start rewiring that natural negativity bias that we have. So you can actually look at your accomplishments, see them on paper, and have a healthy sense of pride around them and not generate excuses. So this brag file, it can be in a Word doc, Evernote, Google, pen and paper, whatever you want. But I want you to take stock of every day what went well and what you were proud of. And make note of any results you got. So if you were able to put in place a new process, bring a new initiative together, even what went well that day in terms of softer skills, conversations that you had with people, your own personal productivity, what you were able to get done, and what were you proud of? Did you help someone? Did you take a step and actually ask a question when you would usually withdraw or avoid the situation? And so this brag file is important because when we look back on our accomplishments, we're much more, it's much easier for us to discount them when we're looking back. So the brag file gives you something very tangible that has your results and your achievements right there. And more importantly, this is really handy if you're interviewing, if you're updating your resume, your performance reviews, so that when you get in that moment, it doesn't all, our own self-assessment can't take over as much, and we don't cloud it all as, oh, I accomplished nothing. Because that might be our tendency if we're reflecting on our own experience, which is why it's so important to write it down in the moment and really reinforce this for yourself. And go on the offense. So if you tend to get very down on yourself, or you tend to be very affected by feedback, criticism, even just afraid of it, it's actually helpful to practice it more, almost like an exposure technique. The more you expose yourself to the thing that you're afraid of, the less intense it gets over time, because you build up that self-confidence and what's called self-efficacy around your ability for it. So go on the offense. You need to seek out feedback so that you can actually build that muscle. And there's a lot of research that shows that when we proactively solicit feedback, we find it more helpful than when it's unsolicited. So I want you to look for opportunities to show your work more, get it more visible, whether that's regularly with your team, the leadership, or even with your peers. So this could look like scheduling a weekly standing meeting with your boss where you're reviewing your projects, you're setting expectations, or it can look even like blogging about something you're working on, something you're passionate about on Medium, on LinkedIn, speaking about it to different women groups. Let's say even, I know today a lot of women are starting Slack channels where they're able to communicate with their friends and colleagues throughout the day and ask questions and get feedback in real time rather than staying stuck. So, and I always say that you should start practicing this in lower stakes settings first. So you don't want to be the first time you ask for input being when you walk into the boardroom or when you're asking for a new job, right? Or asking for feedback on your performance. And so just like anything, confidence is a skill, and that requires iteration, constant practice, and even falling on your face a few times but realizing you won't die, you can get back up, you're resourceful, and you can figure it out. And as I mentioned earlier, imposter syndrome really thrives in places where there are a lack of role models. So we need others around us who have already been there and who can help just normalize the experience for us. So seek mentorship and sponsorship if your organization offers it. That's very important. Joining communities like Women Accelerators and other activities where there are like-minded peers who share the same values as you. So you feel included, you feel welcome and seen and heard. And of course, therapy and coaching can help you work through some of the thoughts and the reactions around imposter syndrome more. But that's why groups like Women Accelerators are so important. And for those of you who are seeking to go further and look for more sources of support, I'm excited to share something with you. So I actually have a free Facebook community that is geared towards career growth and conversations, and I want to invite you to join. So I created this private space because I saw the need for a space where women could get support for the different challenges they face every day. And I created this because I couldn't find that place where I could find other women, where I could get a sounding board if I just needed to work through something I was facing, like self-doubts or freaking out because I didn't know what to say in an email. So I wanted to create a space where there was that opportunity to have those types of conversations. So I wanted to invite you to join. The link is right there. It's melodywilding.com/community. I'll put that in the chat. You'll get it in the follow-up email with this recording. But my intention, it's a growing community. We have people from all around the world. And it's really for accountability, inspiration, and to find advice that you need to really be the best version of yourself in your career. So I hope you'll join us. And other resources. So I have some other goodies for you. So as I mentioned, you'll get the guide, the workbook that's called Untwist Your Thinking. That takes you through the exercise we went through today. And it's a downloadable worksheet, so you can print it out and use it as you like. And I also have a 5-day free course on imposter syndrome that you can get. And I will send all of that in the wrap up as well, so you don't have to scramble. And great, we have some time. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So I am going to just scroll through the comments here quickly. So Julia asked if I have a similar group for people who are not on Facebook. I don't at this moment, but I'd be curious to hear where else you hang out that you would be interested in a group. Facebook, to be honest, it's the place where most people have hung out. I consider it Slack. I'm not sure how many people are comfortable using that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment. And Susu said, yes, we need a village to support and help each other. And that is absolutely right. Does the group moderate each other? I moderate the group. And yes, we have people in there who are, I have pretty strict rules for the group, but I am monitoring it. I really care about it being a safe space. So I'm going to go ahead and type the group in below. Oops. Sorry, I just sent that to someone personally. So I'd love to hear from you too. If you have, I'm going to put myself back on video too. Can you see me? If you have struggled with imposter syndrome, I would love to hear what has helped you. What has helped you get through it? What are some techniques you have that I didn't mention here? Of course, I'm only scratching the surface in a webinar like this. But I would love to hear from your personal experiences, because I think that's what helps each of us grow. We're all so different. We're all in different circumstances. But I'm also happy to answer any questions you have. So go ahead and pop those in the chat. And Susu or Kana, let me know if you want to pop back on to say anything. Like I mentioned, we have a few minutes, so if you want to talk about upcoming events or anything like that, just let me know in the chat and I can unmute you. So I actually, just while I'm waiting for comments to roll in, wanted to talk about applying for jobs. That's a big question I get, and imposter syndrome. So I'm just reading a question here that I got before the webinar. And I often get questions like this. So to the effect of, there's job applications I've been looking at. They're asking about different frameworks and keeping up with trends in the industry. I only have experience with one language and framework mentioned in the job posting, but I'm trying to get my bearings with others. How do I feel confident about being hired for these types of experiences? So this is, what happens is women, what research has shown is that women will only apply for applications that they feel 110% confident for, whereas men will apply for roles that they feel about 60-70% that they meet the criteria. And so I always tell the people I work with that if you meet about 60% of the criteria, there are other techniques, whether it's through networking, positioning your transferable skills, that you can use to show the hiring managers why you're the best fit. So when hiring managers put together a job posting, it's really an idealistic picture of the person they want. That's an amalgamation of all the most perfect qualities they could have. And that person doesn't actually exist. Hiring managers know that, and HR knows that. So they really look for someone who is resourceful, who can learn, who has enough of the qualities that they need and shares the values with the company, and who can grow into the role. So if you can position yourself as about 60 to 70% qualified, then you're in a good spot. So people are asking, people are saying that for them, it helps to just stop thinking, just distract themselves, not to think when they over criticize themselves. Distraction works for a lot of people. I would say to dive into an activity that makes you feel good, something that makes you feel restored or confident in yourself. So someone said, not focusing on work. So doing something like a yoga class or taking time off for a hobby. And if they don't do that, then the work is the only success, is the thought that kind of takes over their brain. So do you have any tips for dealing with people who deflect blame? I know in those situations, it's much easier to accept the fault personally. Okay, so this sounds like we're dealing with passive aggressive or difficult people. I have a bunch of articles about that, which I can share in the wrap-up email. Dealing with passive aggressive people really comes down to boundaries, assertive communication, pushing back, knowing when to deflect blame. You sometimes have to be persistent that something is not your fault, and help that person accept responsibility for themselves. So I will include the articles I have with those. I have lots of tips for that. How do I keep my daughter from getting imposter syndrome as she enters the workforce? Oof, that's a good question. Raising confident girls. I think helping them accept that these feelings will be normal from time to time, talking about them that they will come up. These fears will present themselves, and encouraging them to reframe their emotions. Emotions are just energy. I don't mean to get all woo-woo, but emotions are really just reactions in our body. And so if you can help your daughter reframe what those nerves or that anxiousness means, it doesn't mean they're wrong or they're broken or they're unqualified, which would be that emotional reasoning. It means that they're excited, that they're looking forward to something, that they're entering a new challenge for themselves. And so if you can help them build those sort of inner game tools, I think that will go a long way to stopping that inaccurate self-assessment that happens. Is there any place we can find the studies that you were mentioning? I can send those studies over to you in the resources as well. Someone mentioned that they made a Spotify list that was called Inspiration to listen to on their commute. Yeah, that's something I do as well. Music can definitely have a very powerful emotional effect over you. So Susu says, this is so true. Women feel like they have to be perfect in order to fit the job description, but it's not true. How do we get over this? And she said that Women Accelerators is working on a Spotify playlist, so please send them your ideas, which I think is great. So I already touched on the job description one. So any other questions? I think we're just at the top of the hour, so we're gonna wrap up soon. Yep, we're just very close to the top of the hour. So I wanna thank you all for spending an hour of your day with me today. And I hope you found this useful. You can always email me. I'll pop my email in below, and I will make sure this goes directly to me. So you can always reach out. Sorry, sent it to one person again and not the entire group. You can always reach out. I'm happy to help answer any further questions you have. And I hope to see you inside my community. And I'll see you all soon. Have a great day.